The cabin doors had just sealed with a soft thud when the quiet hum of conversation began to fade. Rows of first-class passengers adjusted their seats, scrolled through phones, or accepted glasses of champagne with the detached ease of people accustomed to comfort. The air smelled faintly of citrus and leather. Marcus Richardson set his briefcase beneath the seat in front of him and exhaled. His suit was dark navy, perfectly pressed, his posture steady, an image of composure. Seat 2A wasn't just a number on a boarding pass, it was his space to prepare for the keynote address waiting across the ocean. A decade of work had led to this flight. He powered up his tablet, the screen reflecting the faint light from the window beside him. He had chosen Skylux Airlines for one reason: consistency. Their promise of excellence matched the reputation of someone who built empires out of algorithms and persistence. To the crew, however, Marcus didn't look like someone who belonged in this cabin. Not yet. A rustle of fabric drew his attention. A flight attendant approached, her smile rehearsed, her tone wrapped in politeness that didn't quite reach her eyes. The badge on her uniform read, "Jessica Miller." "There seems to be a mistake, sir," she said, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "We'll need you to move seats to accommodate our VIP passenger." The words landed like a pin drop in the quiet cabin. Heads turned slightly, some curious, others pretending not to notice. Marcus looked up, his voice calm. "I'm sorry, there must be some confusion. This is my assigned seat." Behind Jessica stood a woman with platinum hair and an expression that radiated entitlement. Her heels clicked impatiently against the floor, and the diamonds at her wrist caught the cabin light. Karen Wickfield, a regular on this route. Her tone was sharper, impatient, as though the entire flight revolved around her convenience. "I always sit there," Karen muttered, her gaze locked on Marcus, as though he were an obstruction rather than a person. "Seat 2A is practically mine." Jessica offered a tight smile. "Sir, Miss Wickfield is one of our most valued platinum members. She prefers this seat." Marcus blinked, holding back the disbelief rising in his chest. "So do I," he replied evenly. "I'm a platinum member as well." A pause. Jessica's practiced smile faltered for the briefest moment before reforming like a mask. "Of course," she said softly. "But perhaps you'd be more comfortable elsewhere?" Elsewhere. The word carried weight. It didn't mean another first-class seat. It meant not here. A man 2 rows back leaned slightly forward, pretending to adjust his headphones while watching. A young couple exchanged glances. Another passenger tilted their phone just enough to record. The air shifted, quiet curiosity sharpening into tension. Marcus stayed composed. Years of experience in boardrooms had trained him to recognize when power was being tested. He had seen this pattern before: polite dismissal followed by subtle pressure. But he had also learned that the calmest voice in the room often carried the most force. "I prefer to remain where I am," he said, returning his gaze to his tablet. Karen's scoff sliced through the stillness. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You'd think people would know how this works." Jessica's cheeks flushed. She shifted her weight, torn between her training and the unspoken expectation from the passenger standing behind her. For a moment, she looked uncertain. Then she straightened, her tone firm. "Sir, I'm asking politely. Please allow Miss Wickfield to have her usual seat. She's one of our priority flyers." Marcus's hands rested on the tablet as he looked up again, his voice steady. "And I'm one of yours too." Her silence said everything. The hum of the engines grew louder, as if filling the space where words had failed. Passengers watched from behind raised newspapers and half-hidden lenses. One whisper drifted down the aisle. "Is this really happening?" Jessica hesitated, then turned toward the front of the cabin, her steps brisk and tight. The moment she walked away, Karen stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Let me make it easy," she said, sliding a crisp bill into Jessica's hand. As the attendant passed, the gesture was small but visible enough to those who cared to notice. A few gasps rippled quietly through the cabin. Marcus said nothing. He simply adjusted his watch, his silence louder than any confrontation could have been. His gaze stayed on the tablet, though the screen had gone dark. He didn't need to raise his voice. Every camera lens in the cabin was already pointed at the truth. The line between arrogance and authority was being tested in real time, and everyone in that cabin knew they were witnessing something they'd remember. Jessica returned moments later with the cabin supervisor, his posture straight, his tone sharpened by misplaced confidence. "Sir, we'll need you to move," he said. "This seat is reserved for one of our VIP travelers." Marcus met his stare with quiet restraint. "Then I suppose you'll have to explain to her that I'm not moving." The supervisor blinked, unprepared for that kind of composure. Karen's expression darkened. The unease in the air thickened. Somewhere near the back, a passenger whispered, "Who is he?" They didn't know. Not yet. But the man they were trying to push aside was the architect of the technology Skylux Airlines had been desperately negotiating to buy. He just smiled faintly and closed his tablet. They thought he was just another passenger. But Marcus Richardson built the very system this airline depended on to survive. If you believe in standing against prejudice and injustice, hit the like and subscribe button right now. Tell us in the comments which country you're watching from, because stories like this belong to all of us. The plane had yet to leave the ground, but Marcus Richardson's story had already taken flight long before this journey. The man sitting quietly in seat 2A wasn't simply a passenger. He was the living product of struggle, promise, and persistence, forged in the streets of South Chicago. He had grown up in a neighborhood where ambition often hit dead ends and talent went unnoticed. His father, Henry Richardson, worked double shifts at a shipping yard. His mother, Lorraine, cleaned offices at night so the family could stay afloat. Marcus's first lessons in endurance didn't come from textbooks. They came from watching two tired but dignified parents refuse to bend under pressure. At 11, he discovered a discarded desktop computer in a neighbor's trash. Its screen was cracked, keys missing, wires frayed. While other kids played outside, Marcus sat cross-legged on the living room floor, teaching himself how to make it run again. When it finally flickered to life, he grinned, not because it worked, but because he had made it work. That feeling would shape the rest of his life. By 16, tragedy reshaped it. His father was caught in the crossfire of a street dispute on his way home from work, an innocent man who became another statistic. Standing at the graveside, Marcus made a silent vow that day. One day, people will see each other for who they are, not for what they look like. That promise became his compass. Through scholarships, odd jobs, and countless nights of coding on borrowed equipment, he built himself brick by digital brick. In college, while classmates pulled all-nighters for exams, Marcus pulled all-nighters building algorithms that taught machines how to listen without prejudice. After graduation, he launched a small startup in a tiny apartment with nothing but 2 refurbished laptops and a dream to change how the world measured fairness. That dream became Right Tech Solutions. Within a decade, Right Tech transformed from an idea into a $2.8 billion force in global technology. Its software helping major corporations identify bias in their hiring, advertising, and customer service systems. It gave companies a mirror to face their own blind spots. What made it poetic was that the very airline now humiliating him had spent months trying to secure a contract with Right Tech to modernize its outdated systems. Inside seat 2A sat the key to their future, and they didn't even recognize him. Marcus had chosen Skylux not because he needed luxury, but because he believed in rewarding companies that claimed to value ethics. Their website advertised equity through excellence. Yet, in a few short minutes, their staff had proven how little they understood either. He glanced around the cabin, the tailored suits, polished nails, and hushed tones of entitlement. He'd been here before. Not in this exact seat, but in rooms that looked just like this one. Boardrooms where people assumed he was the assistant. Conferences where others handed him their coats thinking he worked the door. Every success he achieved had to be louder than the silence his skin color invited. He'd learned long ago that anger burns quickly, but quiet dignity lasts longer. So he waited. What the crew didn't know was that the laptop in his briefcase held the keynote presentation he would deliver at the Global Ethics and Technology Summit the next morning. The title of his speech, Algorithms of Fairness. In it, he would argue that technology should reflect humanity at its best, not reinforce its worst. The irony stung. Here he was, preparing to speak about equality while being treated as disposable in the very system his innovations were built to reform. The captain's voice came faintly from the front cabin, announcing final preparations for departure. But Marcus wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the reflection in the window. The faint image of a man who had fought his way from concrete sidewalks to corporate skylines, only to be told again that he didn't belong. He thought briefly of his father's voice. Look back until they blink. The meaning had become clearer over the years. It wasn't about confrontation, it was about holding your ground until injustice exposed itself. Across the aisle, Karen Wickfield sipped her champagne as though she had earned more than comfort. She had earned hierarchy. The attendants moved briskly through the aisle, avoiding Marcus's gaze. They didn't see the quiet storm building behind his calm expression. Skylux Air wanted a partnership that would rescue their falling reputation. What they didn't know was that the partnership meeting scheduled for next week would never happen. Not after today. Marcus straightened his tie, opened his tablet, and began typing notes. Not for the conference, but for something else. A new kind of report. A different kind of lesson. The seatbelt sign blinked overhead. Engines roared. As the aircraft began to taxi, a quiet resolve settled over him. They had misjudged him entirely. They saw a passenger. They missed the power he carried, and within hours that mistake would cost them everything. Jessica Miller returned to the front of the cabin, her footsteps quick and clipped, her face struggling to maintain the carefully trained smile Skylux prided itself on. Yet behind that painted professionalism, frustration flickered. The situation in Seat 2A was supposed to be simple, a routine accommodation for a valued flyer. But Marcus Richardson hadn't played his expected part. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't shifted. He had simply stayed. Karen Wickfield's sighs had grown louder, her irritation seeping into every corner of the cabin. "I don't understand what's taking so long," she said sharply, loud enough for half the section to hear. "It's one seat. He can sit anywhere else." Jessica leaned toward her. "I'm doing my best, ma'am. The gentleman insists on remaining there." Karen's lips curved into something between annoyance and superiority. "That's because you're being too gentle," she whispered. Her manicured fingers slipped into her clutch and drew out a small, folded stack of bills. With the practiced ease of someone who'd done it before, she pressed the money into Jessica's palm. "I appreciate your help with this situation." The gesture was quiet but unmistakable. Jessica froze for half a second. Then her fingers closed around the bribe, her professional smile snapping back into place like armor. "Of course, Miss Wickfield," she murmured, tucking the bills into her pocket with a subtle motion that fooled no one. A few passengers exchanged glances. One, a young man in a gray business suit, tilted his phone just slightly to the side, recording. Another woman across the aisle frowned and muttered under her breath. Marcus saw it all. His eyes lifted briefly, his face unreadable, but the smallest flicker of something, hurt, then restraint, crossed his features. He'd been through this enough times to recognize what was unfolding. It wasn't about airline policy. It was about power, traded for convenience. When Jessica reappeared moments later, she was no longer pretending to ask. She was delivering an order, wrapped in courtesy. "Sir, I'll need you to move to another seat now," she said, standing straighter, her voice firmer. "We have a regular guest who prefers this one." Marcus looked up slowly from his tablet. "And as I mentioned earlier," he replied evenly, "I'm a platinum member too. I prefer this one as well." Her lips tightened. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." "I'm not," he said, keeping his tone calm. "I'm following your airline's booking policy." Jessica's eyes darted briefly toward the front, where the cabin supervisor was now watching. Trevor Hale, tall, sharply dressed, and known among staff for handling situations that could embarrass the brand, had been observing long enough to decide he should intervene. Trevor approached, his steps slow, authoritative, and deliberately visible to the watching passengers. His voice, when it came, carried that particular tone that sounded polite on the surface, but was soaked in superiority. "Good evening, sir," he began. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding regarding your seat." "No misunderstanding," Marcus replied, his gaze steady. "This is my assigned seat. I have the boarding pass and status to confirm that." Trevor offered a tight smile, the kind reserved for those he believed were being obstinate. "Yes, I'm aware," he said lightly, "but sometimes flexibility helps us maintain the comfort of all our guests." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "All guests? Or just the ones who look like Ms. Wickfield?" The sentence hung in the air like a live wire. Trevor's expression didn't break, but his voice hardened. "Sir, I'm simply trying to ensure an enjoyable flight for everyone." Then you can start by not taking money to remove paying passengers from their seats, Marcus said quietly. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Jessica flinched. Trevor's face darkened for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "I'm afraid that accusation is inappropriate," he said stiffly. "Our crew follows procedure." Marcus didn't argue. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved his phone, and tapped the camera icon. The red recording light blinked to life. "Sir," Trevor said sharply, "you can't record airline personnel." "There's no policy against documenting my own interaction," Marcus replied, voice still even, "unless there's something you don't want on record." A pause, long, uncomfortable, public. Jessica shifted nervously. Karen looked away, pretending to check her phone, her earlier confidence dimming as whispers began to rise around them. Someone said quietly, "She paid her, I saw it." Another passenger muttered, "If that man was white, this wouldn't even be happening." Trevor's smile returned, thinner this time. "We're done here. I'll have to ask you one last time to cooperate, or we'll involve the captain." Marcus looked at him, calm, steady, composed. "Then I suppose you should do that." The supervisor blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in his tone. He was used to people folding when authority appeared. Marcus wasn't folding. As Trevor walked toward the cockpit phone, Jessica followed closely behind, whispering something hurriedly. Marcus sat still, the faint sound of his phone, recording audible beneath the hum of the engines. His posture remained unshaken. The truth was out now, even if no one wanted to name it. This wasn't about airline hierarchy or customer policy. It was about worth, who deserved comfort, who didn't, and who got to decide. Marcus had seen bias in boardrooms and contracts, but here, it wore a uniform and a polite smile. And as the cabin supervisor reached for the phone, Marcus knew this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a moment that would define much more than a single flight. He tapped the stop button on his phone, saving the clip. His reflection stared back at him from the black screen. Calm, collected, quietly furious. He knew what was coming next. And this time, he intended to let the world see it. When Trevor Hale returned, he wasn't alone. Walking just behind him was Captain James Reynolds, his uniform pressed sharp, his expression the kind that demanded compliance before he even spoke. The conversation in the cabin died instantly. The subtle clinking of glasses stopped, screens dimmed, and even the hum of the engines seemed quieter. Jessica trailed them both, her face stiff, her earlier confidence fading into discomfort. She glanced once at Marcus, then quickly looked away. Trevor stopped beside seat 2A and folded his arms. "Captain, this is the passenger refusing to cooperate," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin. The captain looked down at Marcus. "Sir," he began, "my crew has the authority to assign seats as needed for the comfort and safety of all passengers. We're asking you to move." Marcus looked up slowly, his posture still straight, his tone calm. "Captain, I've paid for this seat. I have a confirmed boarding pass and platinum status. There's no policy that requires me to give up my seat to accommodate another traveler's preference." The captain's jaw tightened. "I understand, but this isn't up for debate." "Then perhaps you can show me the written policy that allows removal of a paying passenger for another's convenience," Marcus replied evenly. A few murmurs broke out from the surrounding seats. A woman whispered to her husband, "He's right, there's no such rule." Another voice added, "They're embarrassing themselves." Trevor took a step forward, lowering his voice, his words dipped in condescension. "Sir, we can do this the easy way or the hard way." Marcus met his stare. "There's only one right way, and that's by following the rules." The tone of the cabin shifted. No one dared to speak, but every pair of eyes was locked on the confrontation. Some passengers began raising their phones, pretending to check messages but recording every second. Karen Wickfield, still standing in the aisle, folded her arms and said loudly, "I can't believe this. We've been waiting long enough. He's holding up the flight." Trevor seized on her complaint like an excuse handed to him. "Captain, this passenger is disrupting our schedule." Marcus didn't flinch. "Refusing to surrender what I paid for isn't a disruption," he said quietly. Trevor's voice hardened. "You're being removed from this flight." Jessica's breath caught. The captain hesitated, clearly uneasy with how far things had gone, but pride had already replaced reason. Marcus leaned back in his seat. "So, you're removing a passenger who has followed every policy because a white woman demanded it?" The words struck like thunder. Silence followed, but it wasn't peaceful. It was electric, uncomfortable, alive. Trevor's face reddened. That's not what this is about. Then, what is it about? Marcus asked. The question hung there, heavy and honest. No one answered. Even Karen, for all her entitlement, suddenly found herself speechless under the collective gaze of a dozen recording cameras. Her mask of superiority wavered. She turned away, pretending to adjust her bag. Marcus's phone rested on his lap, the camera still rolling, capturing every flicker of expression, every unspoken truth. He wasn't recording out of anger anymore. He was recording because silence had protected this kind of humiliation for too long. The captain finally broke the standoff. Security will handle this. His voice was low now, but the damage was already done. As he turned to leave, a young man from row 3 called out, "You can't do that. He's done nothing wrong." Another passenger raised her voice. "I've been recording since the beginning. I'm sending this to the news if you drag him off." Trevor ignored them, though his jaw twitched. Marcus stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. "You don't have to drag me," he said quietly. "But understand, you're making a choice you'll regret." He picked up his briefcase with steady hands and stepped into the aisle, his eyes sweeping the cabin one final time. Faces stared back, some guilty, some ashamed, all changed. As he walked toward the front, his phone still recorded. The red light blinked steadily, a silent witness. No shouting, no struggle, just quiet strength walking down a narrow aisle lined with cameras. Outside the cabin door, security waited. Inside, whispers turned into outrage. Someone said, "That man's important." Another answered, "He doesn't need to be. This is wrong either way." Back in seat 2A, Karen Wickfield finally sank into the seat she'd fought for. But the silence that followed wasn't victory. It was the weight of exposure. She didn't yet realize that every smirk, every word, and every dollar exchanged had already been captured. And by the time the plane landed, the world would know. The sound of footsteps broke the tension first, heavy, deliberate, echoing down the narrow aisle. 2 airport security officers entered the cabin, their dark uniforms cutting through the still air. Conversations stopped instantly. Even the faint whir of the air vents seemed quieter, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Trevor Hale pointed toward seat 2A, his voice sharp with misplaced authority. "That's the passenger," he said. The officers exchanged glances, then turned to Marcus Richardson, who was still seated, calm, composed, the very image of control in a scene drenched with humiliation. One of them, the taller officer, cleared his throat. "Sir, we've been asked to escort you off this flight." Marcus looked up, his tone measured. "On what grounds?" Trevor answered before they could. "Refusal to comply with crew instructions." A murmur rippled through the cabin. A woman whispered, "That's not true." A man added, "He didn't do anything." But the crew ignored them. Marcus's voice stayed steady. "Officers, I'm sitting in my assigned seat. I paid for it, I have my boarding pass, and I've complied with every instruction. What I haven't done is surrender to discrimination." The shorter officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the other. It was clear they understood what was happening, but had orders to follow. "Sir, please gather your belongings," he said softly. Marcus nodded once. There was no scene, no raised voice. He bent forward, slid his tablet and documents into his briefcase, and stood up with quiet dignity. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he was giving the cameras time to record the truth. Phones were already raised. Red lights blinked across the cabin. From the aisle, Karen Wickfield watched, her arms folded across her chest, satisfaction flickering across her face. She tilted her chin upward, whispering to Jessica, "Finally." Jessica didn't respond. Her eyes darted toward Marcus, guilt and discomfort battling behind her expression. As Marcus stood to his full height, the difference between him and the 3 uniforms became striking, not physical, but moral. 3 stood in forced power, 1 stood in quiet strength. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, adjusting his cufflinks, "let's go." The officers nodded and stepped aside to let him pass. As he moved down the aisle, passengers whispered words that hung heavy in the air. "This isn't right. He's not resisting. Record everything." One woman, seated near the window, wiped her eyes as she whispered to her husband, "He's handling it with more grace than any of them deserve." Karen smirked as he passed her row. "Maybe next time you'll know your place," she muttered under her breath. Marcus paused, turned his head slightly, and looked at her, not with anger, but pity. Then he walked on. At the door, the captain waited, face rigid with discomfort. He avoided Marcus's eyes. Jessica stood beside him, her earlier bravado now gone. Marcus stopped just before stepping out and said evenly, "You're not removing me because I broke any rule. You're removing me because I refused to bow." No one answered. The silence confirmed it. As he stepped into the jet bridge, the air felt heavier, colder. One of the officers lingered, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Sir, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I've seen this kind of thing before." Marcus gave a faint nod. "Then maybe this time you'll remember it." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and began typing. His message was short, 5 words that carried the calm precision of a man who'd spent his life turning injustice into opportunity. "They picked the wrong person to humiliate." He hit send. The message went straight to his COO. Behind him, the cabin door closed. Inside, passengers exchanged uneasy glances, the moral weight of what they'd witnessed settling like fog. Karen finally sat down, triumphant, but her victory felt hollow. The champagne glass trembled slightly in her hand as she noticed the reflection of her own face in the dark screen across the aisle, recorded, preserved, and soon to be seen by millions. Outside, Marcus kept walking, briefcase in hand, posture straight. He wasn't defeated, he was documenting, preparing. The world had just watched him be escorted off a plane, but soon it would watch something far greater. What happens when quiet dignity fights back? Outside the gate, the air was colder, sharper, an abrupt contrast to the polished calm of the first-class cabin he had just left. Marcus Richardson stood quietly near a column, his briefcase resting by his foot, his phone still in his hand. Security had already retreated, their duty done, their eyes averted. The terminal carried on as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted, something that would not return to normal. He was typing a message to his legal counsel when he heard hesitant footsteps approaching from behind. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus turned. A young woman stood a few feet away, clutching her carry-on with one hand and her phone in the other. Her expression carried both anger and disbelief, the look of someone who had just witnessed injustice up close and couldn't walk away. I followed you out," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My name's Clara Nguyen. I was sitting across from you, in first class." Marcus nodded once. "Yes, I remember." Clara swallowed hard, her knuckles whitening around her phone. "I recorded everything," she said, extending it toward him. "From the moment the flight attendant first asked you to move, until they took you off the plane." Her voice cracked at the end, anger bleeding into guilt. "I just couldn't sit there and do nothing. People need to see what they did to you." Marcus regarded her for a long second. Her face was pale, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear of him, but from the weight of what she had just witnessed. "May I see it?" he asked gently. Clara nodded and unlocked the phone. The video began to play. The footage was steady, clear. Every word, every gesture, every sideways glance between Jessica and Karen had been captured. The camera caught Karen slipping the money into Jessica's hand. It recorded Trevor's condescending tone, the captain's compliance, and Marcus's calm resistance. Even through the tiny screen, the truth screamed. Clara's voice trembled again. "I can send it to you, the full version. I won't edit anything." Marcus accepted the phone and glanced at her. "You did the right thing." She looked away, her jaw tight. It didn't feel like enough. "It was," he said simply. "Sometimes recording is how history remembers what silence tries to erase." Clara blinked rapidly, trying to hide her emotion. "They didn't even care who you were. They just saw." She stopped herself, lowering her gaze. Marcus finished the sentence for her. "They saw what they wanted to see." For a moment, neither spoke. Travelers passed by, oblivious to the quiet exchange taking place between a billionaire CEO and a stranger with a conscience. Marcus handed the phone back. "Send me the file. I'll take it from here." She nodded quickly and typed in his contact information. Before leaving, she hesitated, then said softly, "For what it's worth, sir. I'm sorry. People like that give the rest of us a bad name." He gave a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "It's not your burden to carry, Clara, but thank you." She walked away, shoulders stiff, her conscience lighter, but her faith in fairness shaken. Marcus watched her disappear into the crowd before glancing at his phone again. Within seconds, the video file arrived. He downloaded it and opened a secure messaging channel. He attached the clip, added a few brief notes, and sent it to his legal and communications team. Then he opened a call to his chief operating officer. The line clicked. "Marcus?" "Sarah," he said, his tone steady but colder now. "Assemble legal and PR. Within the hour, Skylux's name leaves our partner list." There was a pause on the other end. "Understood. What happened?" "Exactly what our software was built to prevent." He hung up and sat down in the private lounge, his expression unreadable. A server approached, offering him a drink. He declined. His mind was already moving ahead, calculating steps, anticipating fallout, preparing the narrative. Across the runway, he could see the same aircraft being refueled, preparing for takeoff. Through the large glass window, the glint of sunlight reflected off the metal fuselage. A sterile machine carrying the echoes of injustice at 30,000 feet. Marcus pressed his fingers against the glass. For a brief moment, he felt the weight of his father's old words again. Look back until they blink. This wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. As he watched the plane taxi toward the runway, he whispered to himself, almost like a vow. "You thought this ended at the gate. It's only beginning." Then he opened his laptop. Within minutes, the evidence was in motion, forwarded to his company's compliance division, his attorneys, and his media relations team. The humiliation Skylux had intended to bury under polished smiles was about to surface for the world to see. This time not in whispers, but headlines. And somewhere in the crowd, a young woman named Clara Nguyen walked away knowing she hadn't just witnessed injustice, she had documented a reckoning. By nightfall, the footage had already escaped the terminal walls and gone where no corporate spin could contain it. Online. The first upload came from a passenger in row 3, a 48-second clip titled, "Man Removed from First Class for Refusing to Move for VIP Passenger." Within an hour, it had over 2 million views. By morning, it was everywhere. On Twitter, C2A trended above politics and sports. On Instagram, the still frame of Marcus being escorted down the aisle appeared with captions like "Dignity in Motion" and "They picked the wrong man." TikTok loops dissected every moment. Karen's smug smile, Jessica's fake professionalism, Trevor's condescending smirk. Comment sections became courtrooms. Ordinary travelers, civil rights advocates, and frequent flyers alike condemned Skylux Airlines. Some demanded boycotts. Others called for investigations. A few tried to defend the airline, but their voices drowned beneath a wave of outrage that felt different this time. Colder, sharper, organized. Cable networks picked it up next. One news anchor replayed the footage in slow motion, pausing at the exact frame where Karen's hands slipped the folded bills into Jessica's pocket. "This," the anchor said, "is what discrimination looks like when it's dressed in civility." Another network hosted a panel titled "VIP Racism in Modern America." Commentators debated whether class had become the new shield for prejudice. Every word spoken echoed the same truth. Wealth didn't erase bias. It only made it easier to disguise. Meanwhile, in his downtown office, Marcus Richardson watched none of it. His team did. His communications director, his legal counsel, and his PR strategist were all gathered around a large screen as clips from every network played in sequence. "Do we respond publicly?" one advisor asked. Marcus didn't look up from his laptop. "Not yet, but they're controlling the narrative." He finally raised his eyes. "No, they're reacting to it." He typed a single line into a blank document, reread it once, then forwarded it to his public relations head. The message was short, surgical, and devastating. Right Tech Solutions terminates all negotiations with Skylux Airlines effective immediately. That was all. No hashtags, no press conference, just one sentence. By the next hour, it was on every major platform, retweeted by tech CEOs, reposted by civil rights leaders, and analyzed by journalists who immediately connected the dots. Skylux had been in advanced talks with Right Tech to overhaul their digital infrastructure, an 8-figure deal that would have modernized their entire customer service network. Losing it wasn't just a setback, it was a statement. The financial markets noticed. Skylux's stock began to slide by mid-morning, dropping 5% in the first 2 hours of trading. By noon, investors were calling for emergency meetings. Inside Skylux headquarters, panic replaced polish. The CEO, Richard Halloway, stood in front of a boardroom full of executives who looked like they'd aged overnight. The company's PR head read aloud their drafted statement. Skylux Airlines regrets the misunderstanding that occurred on Flight 2287. The incident stemmed from a miscommunication between crew and passengers. We value diversity and inclusion and are conducting an internal review. Richard nodded stiffly. Send it. The press release went out within minutes and was torn apart within seconds. Miscommunication? One journalist tweeted. We all saw the video. The only thing miscommunicated was their humanity. A late-night host made it worse. When your diversity statement sounds like a manual for a broken coffee machine, maybe you should start over. The audience roared with laughter, but beneath the jokes was a collective awareness. Everyone had seen too much to forget. Still, Marcus remained silent. No interviews, no tweets, no appearances. He didn't need to defend himself. The footage had already done that. His silence wasn't weakness, it was discipline. While Skylux scrambled, RightTech's headquarters prepared something very different. A quiet press briefing was scheduled, not about the incident, but about the company's next initiative, Project Clear Sky, a software suite designed to identify racial bias in real-time service interactions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who followed the story. As the headlines multiplied, a journalist concluded her report with a line that summed it up perfectly. In less than 24 hours, Skylux Airlines went from chasing innovation to becoming the case study of why it's needed. Back in his office, Marcus looked out at the city skyline, phone silent beside him. The world was talking, shouting, arguing, but he didn't have to. His calm wasn't the absence of anger. It was controlled fury, precision forged from years of surviving moments just like this one. Skylux had tried to humiliate him in silence. Now their silence was the loudest sound in the room. The following morning, the 32nd floor of Skylux headquarters looked nothing like the polished image the company sold to the world. The glass-walled boardroom, normally filled with smooth talk and champagne confidence, had become a panic chamber. Screens along the wall showed news outlets looping the same footage. The video of Marcus Richardson being escorted off the flight, the bribe caught on camera, the faces of the crew frozen in denial. Stock tickers at the bottom of every network broadcast bled red. Down another 8%, muttered the CFO, rubbing his temple. Our investors are calling every hour. Across the table, legal counsel flipped through pages of crisis memos. We can't contain this. The video is authenticated, timestamps verified, the damage is real. The CEO, Richard Holloway, looked hollow himself, his tie loose, his confidence evaporated. We've issued the statement, he said, almost to himself. We apologized. What more do they want? They want accountability, replied a voice from the doorway. Heads turned. Marcus Richardson stood there, calm, composed, dressed in the same Navy suit he'd worn on the flight. But this time, he wasn't the passenger they'd tried to humiliate. He was the man they were about to answer to. Security didn't stop him. Someone had already cleared the way. His presence carried more authority than the entire table combined. Marcus, Richard began, attempting a faint smile. I didn't expect. You didn't, Marcus interrupted gently, walking toward the table. That's the problem. He placed his briefcase on the polished glass and opened it. From inside, he pulled a small external drive, set it down, and nodded to the company's AV technician by the wall. Play this. The technician hesitated, glancing toward Richard. The CEO gave a silent nod. The screen blinked, then came alive. The unedited video began, crystal clear. The first frame. Jessica Miller leaning toward Marcus, her smile strained, the audio crisp. There seems to be a mistake, sir. We need you to move for our VIP passenger. Then Karen Wickfield appeared, perfectly lit by the cabin lights, sliding folded bills into Jessica's palm. The room went completely still. Jessica's voice trembled on the speakers. I appreciate your help with this situation. Then Trevor's tone filled the boardroom, condescending, smug, every word recorded with painful precision. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. The captain's entrance, the threat of removal, the humiliation, and finally, Marcus, standing tall, calm, composed. You're not removing me because I broke any rule. You're removing me because I refused to bow. When the video ended, no one spoke. The silence felt surgical, cutting through the air with quiet devastation. Richard swallowed hard. Marcus held up a hand. Don't explain, watch again. He played a second clip, the passenger's perspective, Clara Nguyen's recording. It showed the angles the airline's internal cameras had missed. The crew's nervous glances, the passenger's outrage, the final moment when Karen whispered, maybe next time he'll know his place. When it ended, Marcus turned toward Richard. His voice was soft, but it carried enough weight to bend the room. Your staff didn't just discriminate. They documented it themselves. They didn't humiliate a customer. They humiliated your brand. and the entire world saw it. Richard sat back, pale. "What do you want from us, Marcus?" Marcus met his eyes. "Nothing. I already have what I need." He looked around the table, his gaze passing over each executive. "You wanted to modernize your company with technology that detects bias. Now you've become the case study. So let's talk about accountability." He motioned toward the HR director seated at the end of the table. "Terminate the employees involved, effective immediately, not suspended, not transferred, fired." The HR director hesitated. "We'll need formal cause." "The footage is your cause," Marcus said evenly. "The world doesn't need your press releases. It needs proof that you understand what responsibility looks like." Richard sighed deeply, his head dropping into his hands. Finally, he reached for a pen, signed the dismissal forms on the table, and slid them forward. "Jessica Miller, Trevor Hale, Captain James Reynolds terminated." Marcus nodded once, a gesture neither triumphant nor cruel, just necessary. "Justice," he said quietly, "doesn't always roar. Sometimes it plays quietly on a projector in a boardroom." He closed his briefcase and walked toward the exit. The sound of the door opening echoed through the still room. As he stepped into the corridor, a PR officer rushed in with a phone in hand. "Mr. Holloway, CNN just released an exclusive headline." Richard didn't answer. He stared at the signed papers before him, realizing too late that the signature on them didn't just end careers. It marked the moment Skylux's empire began to collapse. Marcus walked down the hall without looking back. He didn't need to. The sound of silence behind him told him everything. Skylux had wanted to own innovation. Now they had become its lesson. 2 days later, the glass atrium of the Metropolitan Convention Center was packed beyond capacity. Cameras lined the front rows, flashes pulsing like lightning against polished marble floors. Reporters jostled for space, microphones held high, lenses trained on the podium at the center of the stage. The man they had come to see didn't arrive with an entourage or security escort. Marcus Richardson walked in quietly, his navy suit as immaculate as ever, his expression composed. Yet, behind that calm, the weight of the past 72 hours pulsed like electricity in the room. To his left stood 2 renowned civil rights attorneys, their faces solemn. To his right, representatives from national aviation unions, advocacy groups, and even a few airline CEOs who now viewed him less as a critic and more as a mirror. The chatter quieted as Marcus stepped to the microphone. The hum of air conditioning filled the brief silence before his voice cut through, steady, resonant, deliberate. 3 days ago, he began, I boarded a plane as a paying passenger. I followed every rule, held every credential required to sit in that seat, and yet I was treated as if I was unworthy of it. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the sea of cameras, not because of a policy, but because of perception. A ripple of murmurs followed, then stillness again. What happened on that flight was not an isolated incident, he continued. It was a symptom, a reflection of how bias hides behind uniforms, procedures, and polished smiles. It reminds us that discrimination doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through policy. His tone never rose, but every word hit with precision. Behind him, a large screen displayed still frames from the video. The bribe, the removal, the moment he stood in silence as 3 uniforms towered above him. Skylux Airlines has issued its apology, Marcus said. They've taken disciplinary action. But this conversation cannot end with a press release. Accountability without reform is just theater. He let that sentence linger before continuing. So today I'm announcing something different. Not a lawsuit, not compensation, but education. He stepped aside, gesturing to the screen as a logo appeared. The Aviation Bias Training Initiative. This program, Marcus explained, will train airline personnel across the country to identify and prevent discriminatory behavior in customer interactions. It will use real data, real simulations, and yes, real consequences for bias. Because we cannot fix what we refuse to measure. Gasps and murmurs swept the room as reporters leaned forward, typing furiously. One journalist called out, "Mr. Richardson, are you saying you're not seeking damages?" Marcus looked directly into the camera lens nearest him. "No, I don't want money from those who humiliated me. I want them, and every airline, to stop humiliating anyone else." Applause began hesitantly from one side of the room, then grew until the entire hall was echoing with it. Even the reporters put down their pens. When the noise subsided, Marcus continued, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. I built a company that teaches technology to treat people equally. But that means nothing if we as humans can't do the same. Bias isn't a software problem, it's a soul problem, and it's time we addressed it. He stepped back from the podium briefly, letting the silence breathe. The cameras clicked relentlessly, but this time the flashes didn't look like interrogation. They looked like illumination. Returning to the microphone, Marcus concluded with words that would headline the evening news across every network. No one should have to buy respect. It should come with the ticket. He didn't wait for questions. He closed the folder in front of him, nodded to the attorneys beside him, and walked off the stage as the applause rose once more. Outside the building, protesters and supporters alike stood shoulder to shoulder. Some held signs reading "Fly fair" and "Equality has no class." Others simply held their phones, recording history in real time. Marcus stepped through the crowd, shaking a few hands, thanking those who had supported him, and quietly getting into his car. The cameras followed him until the black sedan disappeared into traffic. But even as he left, his words lingered in the air, sharp, truthful, and impossible to ignore. He hadn't demanded justice. He'd redefined it. The week ended where it should have begun, in silence. Not the kind born from defeat, but the kind that follows completion. The cemetery sat just outside the city, a quiet stretch of earth lined with oak trees and white marble markers. The grass was freshly cut, the air still, and the faint hum of distant traffic barely reached the gate. Marcus Richardson walked the familiar path with measured steps, a single white lily in his hand. His suit was pressed, but his tie hung loose. He wasn't here as the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company today. He was simply a son. He stopped before a headstone that read, "Lorraine Richardson. She believed the world could be better." For a long moment, he said nothing. He just stood there, letting the weight of the week settle around him, the humiliation, the outrage, the victory, and the quiet resolve that followed. Then, slowly, he knelt and placed the lily beside her name. "I thought I'd gotten used to it, Mom," he said softly. "The stares, the assumptions, the way some people still measure worth by skin before substance. But it still burns." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his executive ID badge. Right Tech Solutions, founder and CEO. The card gleamed under the afternoon sun. He placed it gently beside the flower. "I wouldn't have this," he whispered, "if you hadn't taught me to see people as people first. You said, look back until they blink. I never understood it until now." He brushed his hand along the stone, his voice quieter. "They blinked, Mom. The whole world did." For the first time that week, he allowed himself to breathe. Not with relief, but with a deeper kind of peace. The kind that comes when you know you've turned pain into purpose. Behind him, the sound of distant birds filled the space. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing her, smiling from their old kitchen table, her apron dusted with flour, telling him that someday his voice would matter. It had. Marcus rose slowly, brushing the dust from his suit. The world beyond this place was still noisy, full of headlines, hashtags, and debates. But here, everything was simple. He didn't need applause or vengeance. Justice had already done what it was supposed to, teach. Walking back toward his car, he passed a group of school children touring the grounds with their teacher. One of the boys looked up at him, eyes wide with recognition. "You're the guy from the video, right?" the boy asked. Marcus smiled faintly. "I'm just someone who sat in his seat." The boy grinned, nodding as if that meant more than any title could. And maybe it did. Before getting into his car, Marcus looked back one final time at his mother's grave, sunlight glinting across the badge that now rested beneath the lily. A soft breeze stirred the petals, as though the earth itself was acknowledging her son's promise kept. He whispered to himself, "You were right. Dignity isn't loud, it just lasts." As he drove away, the camera would have lingered on that grave. The name, the badge, the flower, 3 symbols of where he came from, what he built, and what he stood for. He didn't shout, he didn't fight, he simply stood, and the world stood with him. What would you have done if you were Marcus Richardson? Comment your country flag below to show where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, because silence should never be the end of any story.